Thank you everyone for joining us today for the CTMC 2017 webinar series. Our topic today is trial management, and it will be presented by Mary Farrant. Some housekeeping items before we get started. Everyone except our speaker is muted. This is just to prevent feedback during the presentation, but please use the chat box to type any questions you may have for Mary. If you're interested in CMEs, you must complete an evaluation form, and we'll provide the details at the end of the webinar. For now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Mary Farrant has undergraduate degrees in anthropology and community and public health. Since so thank you. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on. Thank you again. To add for joining today. The present bit of context and why we're watching today. This is and it is an example of a successful project management initiative. Here in for those of you who know, you know that they were, and we have been successful of extinction. So
Sam mentioned, today's management, and I know over-promising here that you ever wanted to know about trial management. In the course session today, to reiterate or expand on about my background, right, I am the director or familiar with Point, and I some on the phone. It is a very running, very robust trial that's second among individuals who room with either a or a minor ischemic stroke, ABCD squared score of or deficit with an NIH stroke scale 3, and we're two with one is placebo plus aspirin plus clopidogrel. The study is being conducted managed here at the California and San Francisco. Through the Department of Neurostroke Sciences group. See, I'm not sure if any opportunity to visit us here in San Francisco, but we are very fortunate over the last 5 years to have come to have our offices in the brand new Sandler Neurosciences Center, which is at Mission Bay, and we are, as a matter of fact, in the process of constructing yet another Neurosciences Center right across the street. So tremendous amount of interest here on the campus and at UCSF in neurosciences. Point is an event-driven trial, which makes it a different flavor of trials. We have experienced some challenges in the management of the trial, which are some of the examples that I'll be sharing with you today, mostly subject accrual, which led us to add international sites to the study in August of 2013 to meet a revised enrollment target, which was an increase of 40%. And there were tremendous lessons that we learned there about adding additional sites, especially international sites, and the challenges to trial management that presented. As Sam mentioned, I've been on the study since 2009, and I have experience with other trials in neurosciences, mostly with aneurysms, and I headed up the core imaging lab here at UCSF before it went over into the radiology department back in 2012. Point, as I mentioned, is a long-running trial, and it also has a very long and intricate funding history, which I will also reference throughout the presentation. Our projected total funding amount is somewhere around $75 million, which makes it one of the largest awards that was ever awarded to the neurology department here at UCSF. I believe, if we move on to the next slide, that I am responsible for revealing my disclosures to you. The cover slide was everything you wanted to know about trial management, which of course references a Woody Allen movie from 1972, where he takes a quasi-medical approach to explaining other challenges to being a human. The movie's still very funny, but very, very dated. I do receive 100% of my salary support from the original and now the renewal NIH award, and I have no other conflicts or financial interests to declare at this point. So what are the objectives for today's webinar? And this is taken right from the syllabus in the email that Sam had shared with you. The first one, I'm hopeful, will be that you'll come away from this webinar with an improved knowledge of the design and conduct of clinical trials, and I'm hoping that it's not that you're able to generalize beyond trials that are conducted under the neurosciences umbrella, be able to analyze some of the information that I've presented, and then at some point integrate any of the content that you consider to be relevant into any trial that you design or conduct. So to provide a little bit of context for today's discussion, I wanted to remind you that the discussion we're having today is essentially applicable to looking at studies like Point, late phase, interventional, federally funded trials that are mainly conducted in academic settings. However, many of the aspects of trial management that we'll talk about here do apply across all categories of trials. And those of you who may be on or considering early phase 1 and phase 2 trials may, I hope, also find the content useful. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the real benefit of today's presentation will be your takeaway from the real-life examples that I'll share with you that come from the Point trial, because there are many, as you might expect from a trial that's been going on since 2009. So I would ask at this point if there are any questions. We will have opportunity at the end of the study, pardon me, for Q&A, but if there are any questions up front, I think now might be the time to bring those up. Okay, hearing none, if something does come up, if you could hold off, and we'll share questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So the focus today is on clinical research trial management. As you can see from this visual, which comes from the UK, that is something you already know about how complex trials are and why effective and successful management of trials is an important topic to discuss. So this is essentially my personal perspective. I came to clinical research out of finance in New York, where I was developing risk models for credit card portfolios. And then I shifted over to clinical research, and I thought, wow, trials are really odd commodities to manage, because unlike a risk model for securitizing credit cards, which is essentially driven by business objectives, clinical trials are clinical endeavors, and they tend to be dominated by the clinical issue and led by people who have a very specific set of clinical skills. But they are also, and as many of you can already appreciate, time-bound, quote, businesses, and they have two interdependent sets of processes, obviously the clinical, but then also the managerial. But I think we can all agree that science alone cannot successfully deliver trial results. So it's important to keep the clinical value and science as part of the mix, and under ideal circumstances assign equal weight to both sets of processes. But I personally, and I'm not sure if anyone who's on the call today can share that, I find that difficult to do. There was a recent article in the Harvard Business Review about whether science can be a business. And it looked back at the 30 years of biotech and the promise of biotech, and the fact that it's attracted more than $300 billion in capital since the late 1970s, because it believed that biotech would produce a revolution in drug therapy. And I believe that, and it is the perspective of the author of the article, that biotech still needs to deliver on this promise. But what biotech has done is created this science business model, which in many instances has blurred the boundary between the academic university setting and what a biotech firm is. There are many trends in clinical trial research, and the trend that we can see here is that trials are there are more trials, they are getting larger. We had the CHANCE trial, which enrolled about 9,000 subjects. We had the Socrates trial, which enrolled 13,000 subjects. And the trials themselves, in terms of their logistics, are becoming more complex as they become more global. And yet at the same time, we are expected to come up with ways to implement the trials that are simple and are efficient in the management of the trial. But the same set of processes, systems that are required to run a trial are basically independent of the size of the study, the scope, the costs, or the duration of the trial. So whether you're enrolling for a small trial or a large trial, you would be relying on the same processes and systems regardless of the size. What this graph is showing you here is the number of registered studies as captured in the clinicaltrials.gov database. For those of you who are not familiar with it, pardon me, it's a registry and results database that houses publicly and privately supported clinical studies of human participants that are conducted around the world. So if as of February of this year, there were over 250,000 studies registered in that database. 80% of them were interventional, 20% observational. Of the interventional, 60% were drug studies, 10% were device studies, and then the rest were behavioral or surgical studies. This represents 250,000 plus studies in all 50 states and in 200 countries. But you can see that it has really taken off. Some of the steepness of the graph is due to registration requirements. So if you wanted to do business and run your trial in the United States, you had to actually register in the clinicaltrials.gov database, and that accounts for some of the steepness here. But from around the beginning of Point, we had maybe 50,000 studies registered, and as we are approaching the end of 2017, we have over 250,000. So a lot of work is being done in the field of clinical research. If we break down that 250,000 by where those studies have originated, we do see that non-US accounts for almost half of them, and that very surprisingly, studies that are conducted both in the United States and elsewhere account for only 5%. The ones that are now currently actively recruiting, there's even more of a powerful presence outside the United States. The number that are conducted both in and out of the US is still holding at 5%, and those that are just conducted here in the United States is a little bit more than those that were registered, but still less than half of the overall studies, which this pie chart shows is around 44,000 of them. Just as an aside, the number one location for clinical trials is the United States, followed by Western Europe, and now China is also, I wouldn't say it's a close third, but it is catching up and bringing more and more research trials and conducting more trials. So as I said earlier, I do think that clinical research trials can benefit from what I would consider to be more of the business management approach, including the techniques and processes that are used to run successful business projects. And that is a quote from Rick Turner, whose documentation I've used often when I've presented this information in the past. And his recent second edition, published in 2010, of a very good book about new drug development, in which he reinforces the idea that project management is very important to the success of a clinical trial, and that its importance cannot be overrated. So what do we get when we define a clinical trial as a project? The first item is that a project is concrete, organized, temporary. And I think that does describe trial management. And it definitely the fact that a trial is seen as a temporary endeavor. It has specific phases, and it typically produces either a unique product, service, or result. A trial has a defined beginning and end, not unlike a project. And what we discover, even though those of us who work on Point usually have to be reminded that it is time constrained because it's gone on for so long, and it's also often constrained by funding or a specific deliverable. And again, if I use the example of Point, we have been extremely fortunate in that We've had uninterrupted funding from the beginning, which has allowed us to continue to enroll despite all the challenges of subject accrual and a protracted timeline, some of which we'll discuss in subsequent slides. And a project also, like a trial, requires constant monitoring. A trial is usually undertaken to meet predetermined goals and objectives. And again, let's say in the example of Point, that goal would be to determine the effectiveness of the intervention in the prevention of secondary stroke in the 2 patient populations I described, those with a TIA or a minor ischemic stroke, with the hope of bringing about some sort of beneficial change or added value. And so the goal of Point, depending on the outcome of the trial, which we won't know for a few more years, would be a change in the clinical management of individuals with either a TIA or a minor ischemic stroke. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, especially from my perspective coming on board with more of a financial approach, is that a trial, like a project, consumes resources, and we have to be constantly monitoring the effect of the trial on its resources. Things like people, cash, materials, time are all the resources that either a project or a trial would be reliant on. A typical approach to managing a trial is to use the protocol lifecycle approach. The protocol lifecycle is the organizing principle for many trials. This is an example taken from the Harvard website. It suggests a more or less linear approach in that you move from one step to the next until you have completed all of the steps, starting with the creation of a study, moving through the submission of the forms and the regulatory paperwork, the review of that information and of the status of the trial amongst its various review bodies, including local IRBs, the FDA, depending on the type of trial that it is. Once you've completed the 3rd step, then you would move into the activation or execution of the protocol itself. And you would then, in steps 5 and 6, be working to monitor and control the execution of the protocol to make sure that you are meeting the goals and objectives of the protocol, and also coloring within the lines as far as the regulatory requirements in order to reach that goal. And then finally, steps 7 and 8 would be organizing the data for publication and then ultimately closing the study out. I like to amplify my approach, the protocol lifecycle approach, by adding a more of a project management approach, which typical project management philosophy encompasses 5 phases. They are, I think, you can map these 5 phases to the protocol lifecycle phases, as you can see here. So trial management steps, project management phases, I think, are sympathetic one to the other, and I think that some of the more structured, standardized activities in the project management phase, particularly performance monitoring and cost control, are of great importance in ensuring the success of your protocol life cycle. So again, we have 5 phases of project management if we want to head down that direction. Each of the phases is linked by the result that each of the phases produces. So if we are looking at the initiation phase, then that would be where we would start looking at the objectives that we want to achieve, and those objectives would then flow forward into the planning phase. And we would start looking at things like resources that are necessary to achieve those objectives and what activities we need to plan to achieve those objectives as well. We also would be looking at ways to monitor the work and to evaluate the results or to control the results, and we would need to define the criteria of evaluating those results. I'm not suggesting that these activities are independent of one another. The activities in each of the phases do overlap, and there is obviously interaction across the phases. And each phase has its own specific inputs, its tools, techniques, and deliverables, and we'll take a look at those in some of the subsequent slides as well. So the first step is, or the first phase of project management is project initiation or clinical trial initiation. Lots of key elements here, many moving parts to trial initiation, and I think that for today's discussion, other than to touch on some of the more important key elements, it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. And as I was preparing for today's webinar, I thought of many of these topics that should be pulled out and perhaps given their own webinar or their own session, because certainly how to get a trial up and running is a topic that's worthy of a lot more focus than we're able to give it here. But the initiation trial for the initiation phase for any trial does include things like defining the initial scope, who's going to sponsor it, who are the key stakeholders, what is the protocol going to look like, what are the forms going to look like, what patient population are you going to go after, etc. The graphic in the background is an attempt to, at a very high level, provide an overview of the main activities in the trial initiation phase. The one aspect of trial initiation that I wanted to focus on today, again based on my background, but also I think on the value of it. We start talking about setting up a clinical trial. And that, I think, is an example of something that if I could go back to the beginning of Point, back in 2009 or 2010, this is something that I would definitely do differently. But again, that's with the benefit of much hindsight. So why would I do that? Because it would give me an opportunity to evaluate whether or not it's possible to conduct a trial given all of the parameters, where you want to conduct the trial, what's your timeline, what are the targets for the trial, are there any financial constraints? And so conducting a feasibility analysis for your clinical trial would allow you to come closer to making a very informed decision about whether that trial is going to be feasible on a scientific basis as well as on a practical administrative basis. There are essentially three types of feasibility analysis, and we've done these to varying degrees for the Point trial. The first one is the extremely broad-based one, which is the program level, when you're looking at which regions perhaps to consider, and this would play a much larger role if you're planning to conduct your trial outside the United States. It would be looking at things like disease prevalence, and does that disease prevalence validate what your enrollment projections are? And that's when epidemiology might play an important role in helping you with your feasibility analysis to determine whether or not this is a trial that you should either participate in or set up yourself. The second level of feasibility analysis tends to be a little bit more focused and customized, and it drills down into specific aspects for the countries and regions that might be under consideration for running the trial. What we've seen here is definitely an increase in automation and reliance on technology, definitely an increase in databases that help you with your site selection. We do have SF, and we did use it to some degree. Two of the sites for the trial, and then also, which unfortunately we weren't able to use, would be relying on analysis, make predictions about based on a number of input variables. I think and have identify whether the region or a country. The important aspects level is going studies in a particular market might compete directly or indirectly with a study like Point that went on for so, that goes on for so long. We have had a variety of clinical trials. Our patients, and that presented a series of challenges that we had not been able to setting up the study. The third one is really the microfeasibility level. Of investigator and the site level. Assessing the competency and the clinical competency, but whether the investigator and the site structure the can demonstrate demonstrate past performance in trials that in related trials, or can share audit results from trials that they participated in. And whether, again, in terms of the infrastructure, it can do things like store investigational product. Can it support an electronic data capture database for clinical data, those kinds of things. I think the general rule of thumb that we approached with Point was that we expected that 10% of our sites would overperform, 10% would underperform, but really the enrollment success for that middle 80% was going to be very protocol dependent, and that was what we focused on when we were doing our original site a feasibility analysis, but again, that was only for sites in the United States during the trial initiation phase. Again, I do encourage sites. I do encourage investigators and sites to conduct feasibility analyses. I think if you read much of the literature, project management literature, or even clinical trial management literature, it does suggest that feasibility is the concept of feasibility is very controversial. But given the fact that most trials run over by at least 6 weeks, less than half meet their enrollment goals, and 15 to 20% of the sites that you may have designated never enroll a single patient. You're conducting a feasibility analysis at whatever level will help you develop a reasonable and realistic assessment of the site and investigators' capability of conducting the trial. Because in that feasibility analysis, you have an opportunity to look at all of the aspects of conducting a trial and make a conclusion about whether to include country in your study. Will underscore that feasibility doesn't guarantee successful results. Obviously cost time and money. The chances of your study. And I'll get off my ability analysis and move on to of trial and the this or the planning phase. Some overlap with the development of a business between your style and this would product what your time, what your financial plan costs, what are the operations, who are your competitors, in often those competitors are could be your competing competing trials. Clinical trial is that you take advantage of when you're doing your planning, that you use project management software, you use planning software, you create an automated and electronic timeline, use whatever planning software with the updates to the budget and forecasting of the again say that I do a lot of financial planning for Point, but I do think Point is in a little financial bubble because, as I mentioned earlier, will for the stated in to have essentially been an uninterrupted trial. I think in part is an important research question that Point is trying to answer. NIH had and that's in the ongoing for the trial. So in terms of planning, another one of my recommendations, not unlike doing the feasibility analysis, is make a comprehensive project plan. And not only make one, but use it. And if you can use a structured approach, and by that I mean use some sort of automated approach to doing it, then I do recommend that as well. And you can see that in the graphic here. It's an extract from just a generic Gantt chart, but it is using Microsoft project. I use Microsoft project because I'm familiar with it. I think in many cases it's overly complex for trial management planning, but it does allow you to do things like set duration, start dates, finish dates, identify predecessors, so for your plan, whether you use a structured approach that is a piece of software like Microsoft project, put as much of your planning elements in it as possible. If you can put in your objectives and individual activities and your resources, it's a great way also to monitor the timeline, indicate what your dependencies are, what your predecessors are, what things have to happen before other things can happen. It also, although it doesn't show it here, is you can attach estimated costs to each of your tasks in a project planning software like Microsoft Project. I would draw your attention because it does show that amongst the first activities or tasks for the startup phase of a trial is completing the feasibility study. And this example gives almost a year.
A copy of the
slides 276 days.
On the website.
So it sets a start date for the study of June of 2006, but the end of the real start date is the completion of the feasibility study, and of course whether or not the feasibility study results indicate that this is a trial that you would want to participate in. Every single plan it would be you would certainly have. These are extremely helpful, and once you've created one, it's very easy to use it as a template to modify for future studies.
That's
one
great.
of the other main elements of